From the Show Me Institute, Director of Government Accountability, Patrick Ishmael. Patrick, welcome back to Big 550 KTRS.
Hey, thanks for having me on, McGraw.
All right, so the Supreme Court is getting ready to decide on some union fees. Now, this is let's break it down. This is different than what people are going to go to the polls and vote on when it comes to a Missouri right to work. That's coming up in August. This is a Supreme Court issue. So what's going on?
Yeah, so government unions are, I think, a lot different than private unions. Government unions can find themselves negotiating with people that they actually put on the other side of the bargaining table. And that's really kind of what the Janus case is all about. It's going to have a bigger impact on 22 other states that allow for agency fees, and the real issue in the case is about whether or not unions can take money from non-union members and use it for their own collective bargaining purposes or otherwise support their political interests as well. And if it goes as folks are expecting it, it looks like in those states that those government unions will not be able to take that money from non-union members. Usually in the state of Missouri, you don't see that attempted. I think the last time that you saw a union try to take money from a non-union member was in Kansas City. The Fraternal Order of Police there tried to essentially get non-union members to pay for their representation even though they weren't members, and they threatened their jobs over it. That ended up just kind of falling by the wayside because I don't think that the unions thought that they could win once that case went to court. But the point, though, is that I think this will at least give folks in Missouri an opportunity to reassess an issue that used to have broad bipartisan consensus, is that there are concerns about government unions collectively bargaining in the public space. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was against it. A whole host of others, right and left side of the spectrum, were against it. And I think that the Janus case won't have necessarily an immediate impact in the state of Missouri. It'll have a pretty big impact in a lot of states like Illinois and California. But in the state of Missouri, I think it's an opportunity to really assess what government unions are and why we ought to be concerned about the relationship between those unions and the political process that they can highly impact and also, kind of draw taxpayer money from through that process.
All right, so back up a second here. So there are government employees who work for governments have their own unions, right? So pick a union, and it's a government employees join a union, and some choose not to join that union. Is that right?
That's pretty common in the state of Missouri, actually, whether you're talking about state or local government. But at least in the state of Missouri, you're not required to pay what some will call fair share fees or representation fees. You don't have to do that in the state of Missouri. In other states, though, if you're a non-union member, you still have to pay fees to the union. So that's, as a general matter, yes, you can say, I don't want to be a part of this union. But if you're in another state where those fair share fees are required, you are kind of still part of that union, even if you're not a part of it.
Right, but the people who aren't part of the union still get the benefits when the union negotiated something on behalf of their employees or in behalf of their members.
Yeah, I would push back against that because particularly in the context of, say, teachers. I think that I'm a great teacher and that my pay should be dictated based off of my merit. I am subject to the collective bargaining agreement that essentially uses my labor as more incentive for the school district to agree to the union's terms. And so I may think that I should be paid more, but I am forced to kind of fall under this collective bargaining agreement that the union says that it's in my interest, but in fact it may not be. So you can make that argument, but I would say that in a lot of these professions that it doesn't really bear out because I think there are lots of folks who would rather be able to say, hey, I should be paid based on merit, and yet the union pay scale in the context of these collective bargaining agreements that are negotiated works against them.
Yeah, but that's all well and good, but I don't see a whole lot of I don't see a whole lot of teachers negotiating on their saying, hey, I'm a great social studies teacher, therefore I deserve more money than the other social studies teacher who's not as good as me, right? It's kind of subjective. Even if it were the case, I get the employee, I understand the argument you're making, but in reality, though, how many schools are negotiating for the best history teacher out there?
Well, that's a great question. And then if the answer is that none of them are, then I think a lot of teachers and teachers that would fall into that category and parents that would want the best teachers should ask why they're not. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that there ought to be opportunities for teachers that don't want to participate in a union, and in Missouri, fortunately, they don't have to pay for it. But if they are good teachers, and if it is in the interest of the district and of the children in that district to make sure that that teacher comes on board, I think that there ought to be a great deal of wider latitude to make sure that you can have that teacher in the classroom and keep them there. I mean, one of the big issues in schools is teacher retention, getting them to actually stick around long enough so that they can create a career in that field, that they're well paid in that field, and that folks are very comfortable with that teacher going forward. And yet, unfortunately, I think a lot of the CBAs, and I'll defer to my education counterparts here at the Institute, for the details of this. But I think a lot of those agreements work against the interests of, say, younger teachers who may not intend to be in teaching for the long term, but they may be great chemists. They may actually be very good in a specific area, but they may not necessarily plan to be there for the long haul, because it does take a long time to build up, the kind of experience required to be paid for what you could be paid, maybe twice as much in the private sector for.
Right.
So
well,
if you want that good chemistry teacher.
Right. That's a whole other issue, is whether or not they're being paid for their value. But again, we don't, we pay a left fielder $15 million. We don't pay somebody who is teaching the next generation, $50,000. So,
yeah, but a left fielder also generates quite a bit of revenue for that team. And that's all, look, I don't know that in terms of personal impact on a child's life, certainly a teacher by far has a greater impact than a left fielder. But I will say that there is a little bit of a difference between those two professions and why they're paid what they're paid.
No, I agree with you. Right. It's not. It is not the same thing, because one is supplying revenue for the team, and yet one is for the greater good of society. But
I would say one other thing too is that, particularly when you're talking about baseball is essentially a giant auction. I mean, you can bid up somebody's salary because everybody wants that player, and yet unfortunately, what you really don't see in the teaching space is that you don't see the opportunities like that, where a teacher's salary and benefits could be bid up as a result of what their merit actually shows. A left fielder being paid $15 million, he's being paid $15 million because he probably has the merit to be paid $15 million. Sometimes they're overpaid, sometimes it's a big bust, but a lot of times it actually represents what their presumed value is. Unfortunately, in the teaching space,
I get that. But if you're a teacher and you say, I don't want to pay the dues to the union, fine. But then you don't get the protection of the union, you don't get the benefits of the union. You go out and negotiate your own deal. If you don't want to be part of the union, fine. You don't get the protection of the union when you want it.
Well, I think that can certainly be talked about. I think if you talk to unions, not all the time are they in favor of that kind of situation, because it also reduces their power. For them to not be negotiating on the entire part of that unit, if you're representing 100 people and there are 1,000 people in that unit, your negotiating power for your 100 people is not as strong. Right. And so, I don't disagree with that. I think that if you don't want to be represented by a union, right, and you should negotiate your own contract and not have
right. And if you could negotiate your own contract and you got a better deal than the union, you would be sure that many people would leave the union and negotiate their own. But over time, people have shown or experienced that they have more leverage when they're a union than when they're not a union. And I know that because look at Major League Baseball's left fielders. They're all part of the union for a reason.
And I'll say this, though. I mean, ultimately, if you are a teacher and you do not want to be represented by the union, there is a strong First Amendment angle here, because unions are, in the government space in particular, are inherently political on a couple counts. One, they actively participate in the political process, and two, the act of negotiating with the government itself is a political undertaking. And so I think that if you are forced to underwrite those behaviors, that is a serious First Amendment concern, and that is what's going to be decided in Janus versus AFSCME. Probably today, it could be tomorrow, right, but I think that is fundamentally what the issue here, and I think it's a very important First Amendment issue.
It's a good argument. Patrick Ishmael, more on the website, showmeinstitute.org.
Of course.
Patrick, have a good day. Thanks for checking in.
Thank you.